As an activist, I've taken a great interest in the census, and that's what led me to start my research master's at Glasgow this year. I've been interested in it because of the enormous potential that I saw in the census, both to affect data-driven public policy, which has yet to happen, although might be about to happen soon in relation to Scots, and also just for the sake of wide public information, given how much public under or even disinformation is out there with regards to Scots and its relationship with English. The value of the census, however, has been debated, and it's by and large been understudied. So I'm going to have to treat today both the value of the data, how usable it is, and as well what it actually contains and what conclusions we might be able to get from it. So my essential question is, how do we best use this data, and how do we interface with it? So how valuable it is, how do we collect together the responses of around 5.5 million Scots responses, how do we wrestle that into something that's meaningful, and does the data change our understanding of the way that Scots is, or that is to say, the lay of the lead? So here are two maps, which you may have seen. The one on the left is what you get when you look up the Scots language on Wikipedia. Unfortunately, with so many itty-bitty data points, you mostly just get broad strokes. There's more over here, there's less over there. And you even get the same kind of thing with the map that the Scots Language Centre's report on the census gives you, which breaks it down by local authority area. Again, that really only gives you a sense that it's all sort of everywhere. There's blue everywhere, but there's more of it in the northeast, more of it in Ayrshire, and a bit less of it in some bits in the Central Belt and Highland, perhaps. The 2022 census, the data just came out, and this was the Scottish Government's take on it. The map is from the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, again giving the same kind of broad brush strokes, but with different colours and a very different data scale. The percentage of people with Scots skills increased, they report, from 46% to 46% from 37%, which is quite a dramatic rise in only 10 years. And I'll be coming back to that in a little bit. They go on as well to talk about which bits it's higher in and which bits it's lower in, broad strokes, and talking about it in a local authority-based kind of way. Before the census in 2011, we didn't really have many good estimates for how many Scots speakers there were. In 1700, we know that the Gaelic population of Scotland was about 25 to 30%, so I had to infer from that if we hold the claim that if all non-Gaelic speakers were Scots speakers, albeit with many in certain professions and social classes who employed and had knowledge of English in certain contexts, then all the non-Gaelic speakers are Scots speakers, at least in some domains, and so that would mean there's about 650,000 speakers. Whereas by 1996, the next numerical estimate I could really get, the General Registry Office for Scotland, which is the precursor to the NRS, the Scottish Statistics Service, estimates about 1.5 million speakers out of the roughly 5 million population. So why do we even need census data? Well, for one thing, it allows data-driven public policy to happen, which is very important. Otherwise, we're just doing stuff for political motivations or because we think it's going to get us votes. Census inclusion as well is important to activists and speakers because it's a kind of official recognition that the thing is a real thing. And as well, it counters centuries of misinformation and social stigma. Scotland doesn't necessarily know itself very well. People often have the idea that their speech is unique to them and don't have a sense that in other places, Scots is strongly spoken. People cannot know in the Central Belt what Doric even sounds like, let alone that there are many places for which it is the majority and normal language to speak. Reports of its death or dyingness have been greatly exaggerated. Why weren't we collecting this data sooner? Well, when standardization of English happened, the idea of a language dialect hierarchy emerged, where the standard is the real language and regional varieties of English are in some way subordinate to it or lesser than it, and that everyone should acclimatize to the way the standard is. And so under Union, the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers wanted to move closer to England and to English economic society, and so framed Anglicisation of Scots as necessary for social and also moral progress of the nation. When they first started taking the census in the 1840s, there was no language question because it was presumed that everyone spoke English. And when they started asking questions on Gaelic, there was a box for if you spoke Gaelic only or if you spoke Gaelic and English, with people in non-Gaelic areas presumably just skipping that question entirely. By the 1990s, there started with the imminent creation of a Scottish executive, there was a push for a Scots language question in the census, but a GRS report recommended against the census question because of problems in defining what Scots is. And so in 2000, the Labour and Liberal Democrat administration, in conjunction with the Conservatives, voted against the census question's inclusion in the census. So how good is the census data if it's been so contentious? Well, a report prior to the 2011 census said that understanding is varied, there's considerable confusion about the meaning of the term, and it just flat out said that there will not be any meaningful data. This has been widely criticized by activists and academics, well, I should say the few who took an interest at all, that given that where we expected Scots to be, strongly speaking, the census corroborated that. And the fact that the results from the 2011 census of 1.5 million speakers aligned with the report, even though the previous report in '96 said that the findings wouldn't be good enough. The fact the numbers corroborated was, in the SLC's view and the view of many others, enough to confirm that, no, it is in fact good enough. McAfee 2017 is the sole analysis of the 2011 results that actually goes into any detail beyond quoting big headline figures about one council or another or the national picture. She goes into the social linguistics of it by gender, age, and geography, and it's based on a paper that she first presented at Fuddlesue in 2015. The results appear reliable, given that they're internally consistent. She breaks them down by council and dialect area, and they all seem to behave with each other with a predictable pattern, with a bit of a drop-off of age, and things varying depending on whether you are in a middle-class urban area, deep city centre, or the Highlands or the Northeast. The expected patterns were found, and that was good enough for McAfee, who seems to be the only one who's looked into this with real seriousness, academically speaking. Here's a brief slide showing you the questions. It was a 4-question matrix of whether you could understand, speak, read, or write Scots. And although the wording of the surrounding questions about English, Gaelic, and a language used at home changed slightly, the 4-question matrix remained. So that's good because that makes my masters a lot easier for the comparison. So there's lots of data given that 4-question matrix, and a way to group those skills together is all the people who said they were speakers versus people who didn't check any of the box for speakers but checked that they in some way can understand spoken or written Scots. And if you want to group speakers and understanders, or as I've labeled them, passive participants to follow McAfee's methodology together, you can talk about some skills, which, if you remember from a few slides ago, was the headline figure and the dramatic increase quoted by the Scottish government very recently. So let's look at so my analysis is going to be mostly focused on geography, but before I do, just to think about data aggregation and the value of how we interface with the data, let's look at all of Scotland between the 2 censuses. So the bottom axis is age groups, increasing age over to the right and increasing speaker concentration over the top. I'm not sure if you can see that second fainter line. The fainter line is the past, and the bolder line is the present. So as you can see, there's been a massive jump in speaker skills, with a line roughly being what you'd expect, that there's a slight generational drop-off, although given that it's a relatively flat line, it's not too dramatic in terms of the loss of intergenerational transmission. The slight dip that you can see in the line there is due to the migrant student population from outside, which would explain why there's a bit of a dip for people in the early 20s. So what's going on here? Is it that are the doubters correct that people are just answering one way in one census and another in another? Or is it that there's been a dramatic increase in skills and speakers and there's some sort of Scots language renaissance going on in Scotland? Has there been a rise in skills or a rise in identification with Scots skills? Are we more used to talking about Scots as an umbrella term? Did the last census, providing a checkbox which distinguishes Scots from Gaelic and English, start a conversation, and are people better able to say, oh, that thing that I understand or that thing that I speak, that's Scots? So to disaggregate that some skills data into speakers and participants, it looks like this. So the some skills line, I'm not sure if you can see the fainter lines from the past, but the some skills line is in green. That's the one we saw before. But the speakers are in red and the understanders are in blue. So what you can hopefully just about see is that the speaker numbers between the two censuses are effectively unchanged, perhaps with a slight dip. The overall number goes from about 30% speakers to 28.5%, which is basically consistent. And what's actually gone on is the rise in some skills is a rise in people who understand or identify with skills understanding. And I can relate to that if you are perhaps an English person in a mixed English-Scottish group of friends. If you can understand your friends, you might not have been conceptualizing that thing you understand as separate because you understand it. But now you've started a conversation, now this label of Scots has been floating around more. Maybe the last census has initiated a conversation which has enabled that identification to take place. So the headline the government puts out might be motivated by an attempt in their part to claim credit for a dramatic increase in the situation when in fact very little has been done. So moving on now to the meat of the matter, Scots by geography. This is the map I quickly knocked up. As you can see, it's broadly the same trends as before. There's more over here, there's less over there. But maps can be misleading because land doesn't speak languages, people do. And most of the people are concentrated in tiny points in towns and cities, whereas large areas of countryside look a lot bigger but don't have many people in them. Existing analysis has mostly gone by local authorities, which I consider to be slightly problematic because it's only 32 data points and the size and population of a local authority varies so widely. They're useful for if we want to pressure governments to make policy. They're useful for if we want to talk about local language plans, but they're less useful for social linguistic analysis because there can be totally different situations in one end of a local council compared to the other. So my research is considering settlements, which is a lot more data points. They've still got large variations in size and population, but they're more useful for social linguistic analysis, and they're perhaps more meaningful to speakers, a lot of whom are still getting to grips with the umbrella label of Scots and the Scots language, or would say that they speak, I speak Kelso, I speak Glasgow, I speak Broch. There's often that very local identification first and foremost, and the Scots label feels new. So a settlement is defined by the National Records of Scotland. It's an area of high-density population. It's got 500 or more people. Scotland has 503 of them, and over 9 out of 10 Scots live in essentially the red dots, which are 2.3% of the total land area. My two case studies considering a settlement-based analysis are in Argyll and Bute and the Doric area, and they are shaded from my map within the same scale, and I've tried to circle the settlements in red, which is hard to see because they are so tiny. But as you can see, generally speaking, as you might expect, the Northeast has got a lot stronger speaker percentages than Argyll and Bute. So Argyll and Bute first. It's the second biggest local authority in Scotland. It's got about 90,000 folk, and it's got 21 settlements in it. And it's partly within the West Central area, as you can see by this map of the West Central dialect area and the Highland line. So here what I've done is I've asked the question, how meaningful is being inside the traditional dialect area as a predictor for Scots speaker strength? So the purple line above is the Scottish national average for Scots speaking. This is the age groups again. They're a little bit more condensed because you don't get the full range of age groups when dealing with it on a settlement by settlement basis. And there's, I think, 9 settlements in the West Central Scots area and 11, maybe 12 outside of it. And those lines are basically the same. So being inside or outside the Highland line or the traditional Scots-speaking area is not an effective predictor for whether you are a Scots speaker or not. So what is? Is geography relevant anymore? Well, kind of. I've picked 5 settlements to show that geography is still relevant. It's not about being in the traditional Scots area anymore. It's about how far away from Glasgow you are, or if it's difficult to access in some way, or if you're a target for inward migration. So I've looked at Rothesay on the Isle of Bute and Campbelltown on the Kintyre Peninsula, both very difficult to access from Glasgow, and that distance has been a cushioning factor against the forces of language shift away from Scots to English. They're both around the Scotland-wide average, but that's very high for the area. So Helensburgh, although it's definitely inside the traditional Scots-speaking area, is the same as Oban, which is quite far away, and they're both around the Argyll and Bute average. So Helensburgh has had the influence of being next to a large international city, and Oban has had the effect, as well as having been in a long Gaelic-speaking area, the effect of being a target for inward migration because it's quite lovely over there. And where else have I got? Tobermory, of course, is both distant and has been a Gaelic-speaking area for much longer, so that as a contrasting example is even lower still. So let's move to the northeast now and see if our model about proximity to cities holds true. The northeast is, so I combined Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire, and Moray as a sort of rough approximation of the mid-northern Scots or Doric-speaking area. It's got 85 settlements, 4 times the number of settlements, and 6.5 times the population. And it's roughly about the same geographical size, slightly bigger. And this is what I found when I looked at a great big chart of all 85 settlements and the age graphs. It looked like a great big mess, and I had to separate it by geographical adjacency and also the strength of Scots speaking, whether the lines looked the same, essentially, so that I could get away with grouping them in some fashion. And this is essentially what I found, how the groupings go, that Banff and Buchan, so towns like Fraserburgh, Turriff, Peterhead, Banff, and Huntly, all performed similarly. By the way, the scale on this graph is a lot bigger. I'd say the Scottish national average is closer to the green line. Actually, it's lower than any of these once you start getting into the older generations. So these are all above the Scottish national average. But as you can see for nearly all age ranges, Banff and Buchan and East Moray in the red and the blue are over 50% across all age ranges. So it's normal, it's the majority community language. So if you're thinking, if any of you have read the vernacular crisis in the Gaelic community, like if you're thinking about numerically based thresholds based off of census, then like that is certainly a significant factor if you're making those kind of comparisons based on numbers. So what this essentially I take as showing us is that proximity to Aberdeen or to large Scottish cities in general seems to be the predicting factor for whether you are a strong Scots speaker or whether you have been more under the influence of language shift over time. And the exception there might be West Moray, but you can account for that in terms of the fact that it's got two RAF bases right beside it, RAF Lossiemouth and RAF Kinloss, which will account for a large amount of non-Scottish-based inward migration to alter the numbers. But again, they're both still above the national average. So my conclusions, well, the questions I asked at the start were about validity, about aggregation, and about what results we can get from the data. So in terms of the validity, as I see it, given that we've roughly got 1.5 million speakers being attested to in 1996, 2011, and now 2022, this strengthens the claims of validity, or at least if they're all getting it wrong, they're all getting it wrong consistently. In terms of aggregation, reporting of whether we're talking about some skills or speakers has to be taken care, and that can yield very different narratives. But more granular geographic analysis is certainly useful for identifying sub-regional trends. The fact that Argyll and Bute was not a homogeneous picture, Aberdeenshire was not a homogeneous picture, means there's definite merit in looking at things beyond a local authority level. Compared to some countries, Scotland has massive local authorities. And as for the results, Scots speaker decline, if any, is not happening rapidly, but being inside or outside the Highland line is no longer a strong predictor. We now have trains, planes, and automobiles, and Scots is diffused into non-traditionally Scots-speaking areas since the original map that I showed you of the dialect areas was made around the 1870s. Access to major cities is a better predictor of speaker percentage, and I think we can combine the access to cities and within the cities the sense that Scots is very social class related to perhaps a broader theory of social marginality, whether that's geographic or whether that's income based. It's about having access to modern professional society. So obviously this is all very applicable, and whether academics think that the data is good enough, governments will use it and the media will report on it. There's a bill set for debate going through Parliament. Gaelic is set to have aerially based linguistic policy. Ireland already has this with the Gaeltacht. But Scots language policy is only just on the verge of beginning, let alone being critiqued after being years in existence and built upon. So if future local plans are going to be based on data, it's maybe important to know exactly how we should be looking at and aggregating and treating that data. Finally, I've got one final example of somewhere else which uses numerically based language policy, and that's Finland. It's got a population roughly similar to Scotland, and you are officially bilingual as a local authority if you have 8% of speakers, that's usually with Swedish, or 3,000 speakers, and that's actually reviewed every 10 years. So you can lose bilingual status if your speaker numbers drop below 6%. If we applied the same criteria to Scotland, based on the census results, every single local authority in Scotland would be officially bilingual, and 5 local authorities, including Glasgow and Edinburgh, would be officially trilingual in Scots, English, and Gaelic, which would guarantee a lot of people educational, legal, and civil rights far more than they already have. Obviously, each language requires its own bespoke measures. Like, we wouldn't take those numbers exactly if applied to a Scottish situation, but it's illustrative of the fact that governments can take census results seriously, and we're certainly going to have to consider the value and the applicability of the data if we're going to start doing that for ourselves. Thank you very much.